For the third time, Alvin Barton died at the age of 28. Reluctantly, I came back again, following the usual pattern of meeting and falling in love, until an unexpected turn of events. He began using his poor mental state as an excuse to visit his therapist frequently. Until one day, I caught them embracing in the consulting room. Alvin smirked and said, "You might think I'm mad if I told you, but I've actually died 3 times, each time next to Selena. I used to wonder how she might save me, but now I think she must be bad luck. I'm staying away from her, and look, I'm doing just fine." I quietly retreated. In my 4th life, whether he lives or dies is no longer my concern. It's time for me to live my own life. Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. I couldn't describe how I felt when I heard those words. Alvin Barton was leaning into Fiona Hanson's neck, lifting her long hair and gently inhaling her scent. Fiona was his therapist. Alvin had been mentioning lately that he felt mentally unstable and needed to see a doctor. I never imagined it would be like this. The intimate scene before me was unbearable. The pain of betrayal instantly consumed all my rationality. I wanted to burst in and confront him, demanding to know why he'd done this. Through 3 lifetimes, Alvin's heart had always belonged to me. I believed this with all my being, but the reality of this 4th life hit me like a sledgehammer. I could hardly believe it, wondering if I had misunderstood something. Then the man I thought loved me most, the most devoted and faithful Alvin Barton, began to speak. He glanced sideways, playfully twirling the hair of Fiona who sat on his lap, and said with a light scoff, "Dr. Hanson, do you think there's really something wrong with my mind?" But those 3 deaths felt so real. Even now, thinking about that pain still gives me chills. Fiona clutched her chest in an exaggerated show of concern. "Oh dear, what shall we do?" "You're not going to die again this time, are you?" Alvin smirked. "How could I? I've spent lifetime after lifetime playing along with Selena, only to die by her side each time. I used to wonder how she might save me, but now I think she must be bad luck. I'm much better off staying far away from her. Look how well I'm doing this time. This life, I have you, Dr. Hanson." His voice lilted teasingly at the end, making Fiona blush as she coyly chided him. "Well then, you've found the right person. Dr. Hanson will cure you in this lifetime." In that moment, the laughter of the couple behind the door seemed to reach my ears. Through a membrane, sounding distorted and unreal. Alvin's words kept replaying in my mind, growing louder, making my heart constrict painfully as I struggled to breathe. I leaned against the wall, gasping for air. I can't recall how I made it home that day. I only remember collapsing onto the sofa, feeling as if every ounce of strength had been drained from my body. As if my spine had been ripped out, leaving me limp and boneless. This is not an exaggeration. The one thing that had driven me to start over again and again was my obsession with saving 28-year-old Alvin Barton. In our 1st life, he died when we were most in love. We had just gotten our marriage certificate, and he was driving us on a honeymoon trip. I was still admiring my ring in the car, saying I wanted to design a matching set of earrings. His all right hadn't even finished when a truck lost control on the motorway and crashed into us with a deafening bang. In that instant, time seemed to slow down. My eyes widened in horror, clearly capturing the image of him lunging towards me, half his body shielding me. At the end, I saw his blood-stained eyes, unable to close, filled with love and pain. I wailed in disbelief, crying my heart out. Only one thought consumed my mind. No, this can't be. Alvin can't die. We still have so much left to do together. I have to go back. I have to save him. Suddenly, it was as if a voice in my head asked me, "Are you sure? Are you certain you want to give up your future to go back and do something that might fail over and over again?" I said yes. So I spent 1 lifetime, 2 lifetimes. And in this life, I'm told he knew everything all along. He watched me struggle pathetically, begging him to live. He even said I was bad luck, that I was the reason he kept dying. It was late when Alvin returned home. I was still sitting on the sofa, replaying in my mind where things had gone wrong, trying to pinpoint the moment his feelings had changed. "Why are you sitting in the dark? What are you pondering about?" His voice was as gentle as ever. He sat down beside me, naturally putting his arm around my waist, acting as if what I had seen earlier was just a dream. I instinctively moved away from his touch. The atmosphere grew tense. A hint of coldness flashed in Alvin's eyes, clearly noticing my unusual behavior. But as if he couldn't be bothered, he didn't inquire further. "I'm going to bed. You should get some rest too." That night, I slept poorly. Even though Alvin was right beside me, my mind kept replaying scenes of his death from previous lives. In the first life, he died instantly in a car accident, blood seeping from his body, soaking my shirt. In the second life, we got married but didn't go on a honeymoon, so that car accident never happened. Then tragedy struck in an absurd way. He came to pick me up after work, and a billboard suddenly fell from above. It landed squarely on top of him. I watched helplessly as the tall man was crushed without a trace. It was as if fate was determined to end his life. I refused to accept it, so we entered a third life. In this life, I quit my job and barely left his side after we married, terrified that he might have an accident if I wasn't watching. We made it to his 28th birthday without incident. On his birthday, candlelight illuminated his bright eyes. In the warm glow, he confessed his love to me, his eyes moist. "Selena, I'm so glad to have you." My heart raced, but I noticed his smile fading, his face becoming blurry. An overwhelming sense of dread nearly knocked me over. Then Alvin coughed up a mouthful of blood. Perhaps too much time had passed, or perhaps my panic left no room for other memories. I couldn't remember the name of his illness, some rare condition. His life ended so abruptly, almost ridiculously rushed. My final memory was of a stark white hospital room. In the deathly silence, only the faintly glowing monitor by his ear persisted in beeping, as if counting down his last moments of life. I couldn't accept it. How could I? Alvin and I had known each other since we were young. Back then, I was a country bumpkin who had come to the city. Because I was fairly pretty and had an enviable talent for dance. Some girls in my class started bullying me, both subtly and openly. I endured it silently until the day they knocked over my grandmother's pancake stall. Amidst the mess on the ground, I helped my grandmother up with tears in my eyes. The girls, dressed in their fancy clothes, laughed down at us, their voices shrill. They called me Pancake Girl and told me to go home and make pancakes. My grandmother was mute. She moved her lips silently, gesturing to wipe the oil stains off my clothes. The girls laughed even harder. That's when Alvin appeared. He was holding a camera and made one phone call to summon the school administrators. He was a good student from a well-off family, quite influential in our small town. It was evening, and though the day had been gloomy, somehow at that moment, sunlight broke through the thick clouds and shone directly on Alvin. He reached out his hand, offering a clean, neatly folded handkerchief. The first thing he said was, "I'm sorry." I wanted to capture evidence first, so I didn't come to help right away. Even now, I still remember how my heart pounded that day. Fierce and strong, it sustained me as I traversed alone through countless worlds where he died. Even on the second morning, I still felt somewhat dazed. Alvin had gotten up by then. He put on the clothes I had ironed and glanced at me as I was setting breakfast on the dining table. "Aren't you going to the Royal Ballet anymore? Are you just going to stay at home like this? There's not much for you to do here, is there?" His voice trailed off with the last few words, tinged with confusion. My hand paused as I was wiping the table. I looked up at him, only to see him quickly avert his gaze. "You can have breakfast at home." "I won't eat. Don't see me off, and don't come to pick me up in the evening either. I'm going to see Dr. Hansen." He rubbed his temples as he spoke, his tone indifferent. If it were before, I would have certainly worried about his condition. But now, I only felt a chill in my heart. He was about to turn 28, and we were also about to get our marriage certificate. In previous lives at this time, I had completely lost my motivation to work, spending my days in constant fear and worry. So I had simply quit my job at the Royal Ballet, truly becoming a housewife. Back then, he thought I was too tired and said with a smile, "Then don't go anymore. From now on, just dance for me alone. With me here, what do you have to worry about?" I accompanied him to and from work, and he confidently introduced me to his colleagues. He would raise his hand in a show-off manner, displaying our matching rings. But now, he looked at me warily and coldly, telling me, "Stop watching me all the time. Find something to do for yourself." My breath caught, followed immediately by the loud slam of the front door, leaving the house in an eerie silence. I sat at the table, mechanically picking at the breakfast in front of me. It was still warm, but it tasted unusually cold in my mouth. How did it come to this? Since Alvin started his treatment, it seemed like the distance between us had gradually grown. He began to tire of and reject my presence. After spending 3 lifetimes with me, had he now found true love? But saving Alvin was like a pre-programmed mission in my life. Suddenly being asked to give up felt like losing the center of my existence. I felt I should rush up and confront him, ask him if all my efforts in the previous lives were just a joke in his eyes. But then why did he keep playing along with me time after time? Yet I still acted as if nothing had happened. I watched helplessly as Alvin gradually distanced himself from me, grew cold towards me, as our conversations became fewer and fewer. I watched as he and Fiona Hansen grew closer. And on several nights, he didn't even bother to pretend anymore, openly calling Fiona from the balcony. In the darkness, even through the glass, I could see the smile playing on Alvin's lips. Then one evening, I sat stubbornly at the dining table like a neglected wife, waiting for him to come home. It was almost 9 o'clock when Alvin finally returned, after I had reheated the meal countless times. Only this time, Fiona came back with him. Fiona nodded a greeting to me as she entered, naturally changing into indoor shoes before stepping into the living room. "Don't misunderstand, Miss Crowley. I'm only here to help Mr. Barton with his treatment," she said. Mr. Barton described being troubled by past or non-existent memories. "So I'm here to examine the home environment. It's actually a significant factor affecting one's mental state." Her smile was open, her words professional. When addressing me, she completely lacked the coquettishness she displayed around Alvin, appearing quite proper and dignified. It almost made me feel as if the intimacy between her and Alvin had been my imagination. But the next moment, as her eyes met Alvin's, she flashed a meaningful smile, conveying their unique understanding. "These items should be discarded, and the sofa arrangement over here needs to be redesigned." Her red lips moved, but eventually I could no longer make out what she was saying. I only saw our carefully decorated home being completely transformed by her suggestions. Her gaze turned smug and challenging as she raised her chin to look at me. "One must always look forward. It's best to discard old things." She removed a charm from her bag and hung it by the entrance, her tone coy. "Mr. Barton, seeing something bright and colorful before leaving home will improve your mood. This is our marital home," I said, my lips trembling as I watched Alvin's mouth curl up involuntarily while he reluctantly saw Fiona off. "What's wrong?" he asked, puzzled. "You brought another woman into our carefully designed marital home, casually rearranging our decor and leaving her mark. Selena, Dr. Hansen is a professional. If something isn't right, it should be changed. Should I just remain ill?" His tone was somewhat exasperated, but I detected a hint of impatience. "Don't overthink it. If you don't like the current arrangement, we can change it again later based on your preferences." Bitterness welled up in my throat. I took a deep breath and forced a smile as I spoke. "Alvin, aren't we supposed to register our marriage next month? Do you still want to?" Alvin frowned. "What are you on about? Just because Fiona came to look at the house?" "Selena, I think you have too much free time on your hands. If you have nothing to do, find something. Don't fixate on me and let your imagination run wild. Now you're even saying things like this." He was about to say more, but suddenly froze. My tone was flat and cold. "Let's not." Just 3 words, but they were difficult for me to say. Alvin didn't react immediately, his eyes showing confusion. "What did you say?" His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, sounding as if he was suppressing some joy. I suddenly remembered what he had said in front of Fiona. "She's always clinging to me, like bad luck following me around. How can I not have issues?" Tears welled up in my eyes, but I held them back. Instead, a wave of grief and anger rushed to my head, my cold blood seemingly ignited. I laughed silently. "What? Are you satisfied that I said we shouldn't get married? Alvin, you haven't really fallen for someone else, have you? Eager to get rid of me? Realizing I seemed to be joking and toying with him. His face instantly darkened, his expression frightening. Selena, I think you're the one with mental issues. Is this funny to you? No wonder I've been feeling off lately. Turns out it's because of your influence. He looked down at me condescendingly, angrily tossed his coat aside, and went to sleep in the guest room. The living room fell silent again, but the oppressive atmosphere lingered. I tilted my head back to look at the ceiling, and the tears I had held back for so long didn't retreat, but rushed out competing with each other. After that day, the relationship between Alvin and me became even more strained. He began to seek out Fiona without any attempt to hide it. Faced with my heartbreaking questions, he just looked at me coldly, his expression mocking. Then why don't you give up on me? You can call off the wedding if you want. Your world doesn't revolve around just me. He was very calm, making me look like the crazy one in comparison. I was left speechless. I can't accept this. I've invested 4 lifetimes. My sunk costs are too great, so great that I lack the courage to abandon everything from before. I kept thinking I should wait a bit longer, and then I waited until our wedding day. The night before, he didn't come home. The next day, I stood outside the register office for a long time. After dialing I don't know how many calls, someone finally answered. It was Fiona Hansen. Miss Crowley, Alvin was celebrating my birthday with me last night. He drank a bit too much and hasn't sobered up yet. When I rushed over, Fiona opened the door for me. Inside the apartment, she leaned against the wall wearing something flimsy, looking indescribably alluring. Following her gaze, I saw the man getting dressed inside. Today I had rarely put on makeup and done my hair up. But at this moment, my hair was a mess. And I was still holding our documents, looking utterly disheveled and ridiculous. In contrast, Alvin, who turned to look at me, showed only slight surprise. He didn't lose his composure, but instead asked me, "What are you doing here?" Fiona thoughtfully closed the door for us. But her eyes watching the scene were so piercing, they shook what little reason I had left. "What am I doing here?" "Alvin Barton, are you sober?" My blood rushed to my head, and I couldn't help but throw the documents on the ground. "If you don't want to get married, just say so. There's no need to insult me like this." He paused for a moment, then slowly picked up the papers and smirked. "I thought you knew already. I didn't expect you to still be so persistent." He straightened up, standing in front of me and looking down at me coldly, as if I were a stranger. "Can't you tell? I want to dump you." My reason snapped like a broken string. I stared at him with wide eyes, unable to believe what I was hearing. I tried to find some trace of the man I once knew. But I failed. He lounged on the bed, watching my reaction with amusement. "Alvin Barton, what do you think death feels like?" After a long silence, I heard my voice, hoarse and frightening. "I haven't experienced death, but it must be close. That kind of pain is worse than dying. I'm so tired, so exhausted. I don't even know why I keep holding on." Alvin visibly stiffened. His pupils trembled uncontrollably. Panic flashed across his face, and he lowered his gaze, unnaturally avoiding my eyes. He knew what I was talking about. After all, he also had memories of 3 lifetimes. He said nothing, and I suddenly felt pathetic. It was as if a century of silence had passed. "You think I'm not tired?" Alvin finally spoke, dying 3 times. "Do you think that was easy for me? Every time we started over, I also held on to the hope that maybe this time would be different. And I blindly followed the same path as before. But time and time again, we fell into the same trap. Do you understand how that feels?" By the 3rd time, I was actually ready to give up. I wanted to just die and be done with it. "Why should we come back again? Selena, I actually admire you quite a bit. Standing at the beginning, looking at an inevitable end. Then looking back from the end to the past, don't you feel despair? No matter how hard we try, we can't change anything." He choked up a bit, his eyes seeming to mist over. "Accept it. This is reality. Our story can only end there. I die at 28, and what about you? Does the rest of your life die with me? Let yourself go. As his last words lingered in the air, Fiona opened the door. Sunlight streamed in, as if guiding him towards a new life. He stepped towards Fiona without hesitation. I struggled to move, watching as Fiona and he stood together, looking like a perfect match. Miss Crowley, Alvin said these strawberry tarts are delicious. I bought an extra one for you to take home, she said, offering me an elegantly packaged dessert. I glanced at it, my hand recoiling as if electrified. That deep-seated fear surged through me again, leaving me paralyzed. I used to love strawberry tarts. In our second life together, Alvin even learned to make them himself. But I always complained about his lack of skill, insisting on buying them from only one particular shop. He would stop by the patisserie across the street after work to buy them for me. Then one day, a billboard fell from above, splattering strawberry sauce everywhere. That scene is forever etched in my memory. Since then, I've never touched strawberries again. They taste wonderful. You should try them again, Alvin said, his voice calm and light, as if all our shared history had blown away like a gust of wind. In our fourth life, I didn't make it to Alvin's 28th year. Alvin packed up all his belongings. As he dragged his suitcase out, he was as cold as a stranger. He even destroyed all our photos, one by one. As I watched him emotionlessly throw away everything that once held countless memories of us into the bin, that suffocating feeling of my heart being squeezed tight overwhelmed me. The house is yours. That's it then, Alvin said as he left, without a trace of attachment. The strawberry tart still sat on the table, its bright red sauce looking like fresh blood. Expressionless, I shoved it into my mouth. The familiar taste filled my entire mouth, seemingly mixed with an indescribable metallic tang. I struggled to swallow it. When I came to my senses, I was already in tears. The jarring ring of the phone suddenly broke the silence. I answered it to hear the principal dancer from the ballet company. Selena, dear, we're short a role for our new production. We've been looking for ages but can't find anyone suitable. Do you think you could help us out? I paused for a moment, then replied with a simple before adding, I can come today. Are you still rehearsing at the usual place? After receiving an affirmative response, I rubbed my temples and headed straight for the destination. If Alvin was the most important thing in my life, then ballet was undoubtedly the second. In our first life, encouraged by Alvin, I took my A-levels in dance and successfully joined a local ballet company after graduation. In subsequent lives, I followed a similar path. But my dance career always came to a halt at this point. Because of Alvin Barton's death, I had to abandon everything else in my life to fully face the insurmountable mountain of life and death. Now, I wonder, since Alvin doesn't need me anymore, should I return to my own path? But the effect was poor. As I stepped back onto the rehearsal floor and followed the music, I found it impossible to recapture that feeling. After I missed the beat once again, the instructor shook his head and sighed softly. Selena, why don't you take a moment to compose yourself on the side? As the music faded, the dancers dispersed for a break, but I remained lost in thought. Once, I was the instructor's pride, a young prodigy with extraordinary talent. She used to praise me, saying I was the center of attention just by standing there. But now, I felt trapped in a quagmire, unable to find my way out. Miss, how long will we be rehearsing for this performance? I asked. 2 months from now, she replied. I was taken aback by her answer, realizing that the premiere would fall on Alvin's 28th birthday. In my previous attempts to save Alvin from his fate, the Royal Ballet had flawlessly executed their premiere without me. Perhaps I didn't need to participate this time either. After all, they hadn't sought me out in the past. With this thought, I was ready to bow out. But as the music started again, I watched everyone compose themselves and throw themselves wholeheartedly into the dance. The words of resignation caught in my throat, impossible to utter. The moment I left the studio, I booked a flight ticket. My destination was a small town in the southwest, where the dance had incorporated local folk elements. Having been away from the Royal Ballet for so long, I was out of touch with their progress. My instructor was supportive. It'll be good for you to learn and clear your head. The wind tousled my hair as I exhaled deeply, suddenly feeling a sense of release. It was time to let go. I had my own 28th birthday to look forward to. By the time I returned from my trip, nearly a month had passed. During that month, I had wandered through mountains and forests, chatting and working alongside local grandmothers. When we were happy, we would dance in the evening sunlight. The people there, regardless of age or gender, possessed a unique gift for dance. Not technically refined, but wonderfully free and spontaneous. Without formal music, we would hum and tap on our baskets. The unfamiliar dialect and sunshine enveloped me, soothing my wounded and empty heart. Back on familiar ground, instructor came to pick me up. Seeing my relaxed smile, she beamed back. "The Royal Ballet has a performance tonight. Why don't you come and watch?" she suggested. I agreed with a smile, planning to go home and change first. Unexpectedly, as I approached my front door, I saw Alvin leaning against it. And beside him, arm in arm, was Fiona. Seeing me, Fiona approached enthusiastically, her face wreathed in smiles. "Selena, have you been on holiday?" she asked cheerfully. My gaze, however, was drawn irresistibly towards Alvin. But he skillfully avoided meeting my eyes. My heart clenched painfully, and I forced a smile as I turned to Fiona. "Did you need something?" I asked. "Oh, it's like this," Fiona explained. "Alvin said he left something here and wanted to pick it up. We also just got our marriage certificate today, so we thought we'd share the good news. We haven't set a date for the wedding yet, but you must come, of course." Fiona's smile was dazzling, the ring on her finger catching the sunlight blindingly. I felt dazed, unable to put a name to the emotions swirling within me. After opening the door and inviting them in, Alvin went to look for something, while Fiona sat in front of me, gushing about how wonderful Alvin was. As I watched the happiness radiating from her face, I felt a tightness in my chest. They were certainly moving fast. Alvin seemed desperate to get rid of me. "Where are those matching bracelets we bought after A-levels?" Alvin suddenly asked, catching me off guard. I instinctively tucked my hands into my sleeves, not wanting him to discover that I was actually wearing both bracelets on my wrists. After A-levels, he had worked 2 grueling summer jobs, getting up at dawn and working late into the night, just so he could put one of the bracelets on my wrist when I started university. Later, when we had more money, he began buying me more expensive jewelry. Those 2 bracelets had been put away. They were from a moderately well-known luxury brand, not too expensive at the time. But now they had become collector's items, difficult to acquire even with money. "Fiona really likes them. You can just give me mine back," he said. The smile on my face became difficult to maintain. When had Alvin become such a tactless person? For the sake of his current girlfriend, he actually didn't mind the awkwardness of asking his ex for things back. I was just as undignified, still foolishly treasuring these 2 bracelets on my wrists like they were precious. While I was lost in thought, Alvin had actually already noticed. He stepped forward and unceremoniously grabbed my forearm, exposing my pale wrist. Fiona gasped beside him. "Oh, they were on Selena's wrists all along. Why are you wearing both of them?" "Alvin, maybe Selena really likes them." "I'll pass. Let her keep them." At that moment, I felt completely exposed. Alvin's slightly mocking gaze and Fiona's sympathetic yet triumphant smile all cut into me like sharp knives. "Selena, you still can't let go, can you? You're still so in love?" Alvin sneered as he spoke. Grief and anger surged in my heart. I forcefully shook off Alvin's hand. It was at this moment that I realized the man before me was no longer the Alvin who once loved me. I smiled resignedly, undid the clasps on the bracelets, and threw both of them into the rubbish bin. "I'm sorry, you've got it all wrong. I only wore them because they're expensive. Can't I pretend to be rich? But when too many people like something, it becomes disgusting. I've never liked sharing with others. If you want them, go fish them out." That day, Alvin left angrily with his arm around Fiona. Before leaving, he didn't forget to humiliate me one last time. "Without me, try not to off yourself. This time, don't be the first to die." I no longer had any lingering affection for him and retorted without hesitation. "There's still a month left. Say your goodbyes to your wife properly. Don't leave it too late for last words." Watching his retreating figure, I decisively picked up the rubbish bag and threw it into the large bin outside the door in one go. That's better. There won't be any trace of him left in the house now. I looked around, thinking I might as well redecorate the place in a couple of days. That evening, I went to see a ballet performance. My colleague on stage saw me and smiled in my direction. By the end of the show, I realized my face was streaked with tears. On my way to deliver flowers backstage, I suddenly heard sobbing. I looked over and saw what appeared to be a mother and daughter. The little girl was crying, while her mother comforted her. "It's all right, Gemma. We'll come back next time. I'm sure she'll return." As I stood there, unsure what to do, the little girl suddenly looked up and met my gaze. In the next moment, her eyes lit up with an extraordinary gleam, staring at me in disbelief. "Selena!" Before I could react, she had run up to me. "Oh, you're Selena Crowley, aren't you? My daughter is your biggest fan. She's been so worried about you since you haven't been in the last few Royal Ballet performances. She insisted on coming backstage to check on you. Ever since this child saw your performance 3 years ago, she's been determined to learn ballet. She says she wants to dance on the same stage as you someday." Her mother's words hit me like a pebble dropped in still water, sending ripples through my heart. The girl shyly peeked at me, her round face flushed with excitement. Her mother enthusiastically insisted on taking a photo of us together. Before they left, the girl tugged at my sleeve and asked timidly, "Selena, did something happen? Why haven't we seen you perform in so long? You'll keep dancing, won't you? I will always be here to support you." I paused, feeling my eyes grow unexpectedly moist. I knelt down and patted her head, nodding solemnly. "Yes, I have a performance next month. Make sure you come and watch, Gemma." I smiled as I watched the little girl's eyes widen with uncontainable joy. She skipped away, and I realized my instructor had appeared beside me. "Have you found your motivation again?" I nodded, softly murmuring, Time flew by as I threw myself into rehearsals, and before I knew it, the day of the premiere had arrived. When I woke up in the morning, an alarm I hadn't set suddenly went off. Confused, I went to turn it off, only to find it was a calendar reminder. That's when it hit me: today was also Alvin Barton's 28th birthday. The alarm was set to mark 12 hours until the time he had been diagnosed with his illness in the previous life. I suddenly felt disoriented, unable to help wondering, would he die in this life too? Was it really because of me that he kept dying over and over? If he didn't die, I would wish him well. If he did die, then... Time didn't allow me to consider it further, as my instructor was already calling. We had to ensure everything was perfect for our final rehearsal. The day flew by, and evening arrived. Our performance was scheduled for 7 p.m. which was also the time when the incident had occurred in the previous life. My heart was pounding, though I wasn't sure why I was so nervous. The instructor told the members to rest and adjust their mindset for the stage in an hour. I went outside for some fresh air. Suddenly, my phone rang, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet. I answered quickly, only to realize it was Alvin calling. His voice was soft on the other end. "Selena, if I died, would you be sad? There's still an hour left." The first 2 times he died, it had been sudden, before his birthday. Only the 3rd time, when he was diagnosed on his birthday, did I have any time to say goodbye. I was stunned. I wanted to say flippantly, "No, you're going to die anyway, aren't you? Whether you're with me or with Fiona." To mock his infidelity. But when I opened my mouth, I just sighed softly and said, "Perhaps." "If I die, will you start over again?" he asked. Perhaps it was the barrier of the screen, but I couldn't discern his emotions. His voice was just a bit hoarse, sounding slightly distorted through the phone. This time I didn't hesitate, responding firmly, "No." If he died again this time, it would only prove that all my previous efforts had been in vain. If fate was set in stone, nothing could change it. I wouldn't entertain the thought of starting over again. He was silent for a moment, then spoke again, his voice faint. "All right. Good luck with your performance." As I hung up the phone, a wave of inexplicable emotions washed over me. But the most prominent feeling was a sense of profound sadness. The kind of sadness that comes from being unable to escape one's fate, no matter how many times the cycle repeats. I walked backstage, where the dancers were already applying makeup and changing into their costumes. I composed myself, preparing for the performance ahead. At 7 o'clock, everything reset. I stepped onto the familiar stage, gazing at the audience that filled the seats. Taking a deep breath, I slowly raised my hand. The music ebbed and flowed, from frantic to calm, before finally fading away. As the piece ended, I hadn't made a single mistake. When the lights illuminated me, I saw the faces in the audience, tilted upwards with expressions of joy and wonder. It was the same look I had worn countless times as an audience member, watching the dancers on stage. It was in those moments that the seed of my dream had been planted in my heart. Now, at last, it had blossomed and borne fruit. I was reborn. As I left the stage, my instructor presented me with a bouquet behind the curtain. She wiped away a tear and said, "Selena, I knew you were the right choice. To be honest, I was worried earlier. You hadn't practiced for so long, I wasn't sure if you could keep up. But your boyfriend came to me, insisting you'd be fine, promising over and over. Oh, speaking of which, why didn't he come to give you flowers for your debut?" My mind stuttered, and I asked reflexively, "Wait, Alvin came to see you?" "Yes, indeed. I wasn't planning to call you back. You said you were leaving the Royal Ballet, not taking a holiday. It didn't seem right to ask you to return. But Alvin came to me personally, asking for another chance for you. He said you hadn't thought it through properly when you left. I thought it was a shame to lose you, and figured you might be too embarrassed to approach me yourself. That's why I decided to give you a call," she rambled on. My mind went blank. So this opportunity had been secured for me by Alvin? But why would he do that? The memories of 4 lifetimes were a chaotic mess, suddenly crashing over me like a tidal wave, making my head throb as if it might explode. I felt like I had forgotten something crucial. But what was it? A nearby phone jolted me back to reality. On the other end was Fiona's voice, eerily calm, "Alvin is dead." But when I arrived, Fiona said he was holding on, wanting to see me one last time. I found this notion absurd, a surreal disconnect from reality. In a daze, I entered his hospital room. It was pristine and white, like heaven, just as it had been in our 3rd life together. He lay on the white bed, his face bearing an odd serenity. Seeing me, he seemed pleased. "You're not crying this time. Quite composed, aren't you?" "Well, you're going to die anyway. After so many deaths, I suppose I've gotten used to it," I replied, my voice flat. Even as the words left my mouth, I found them incredible. It was as if the massive weight that had been pressing on my heart had dissolved without my noticing. He didn't close his eyes, staring intently into mine. "So you're really just going to watch me die? No more star over?" "Then why are you still here?" he asked with a smile. In that instant, everything around me began to blur and fade, like a dream on the verge of waking. The fabricated world started to warp and distort. Only Alvin's face remained clear. His smile was faint, as if he too was about to vanish. "Selena, you shouldn't be here. You need to go back. Back to your life, back to your stage, back to your 28-year-old self. I'm already dead." "You said you've let go." The world fell silent. Only his voice remained, crystal clear, like a sharp sword piercing straight through my heart, puncturing the illusion of 3 lifetimes I had constructed to deceive myself. Oh, I remember now. There was no cycle. He had, out of love, accompanied me through 2 more lifetimes. And now, also out of love, he had to force me to face reality. It was I who had become trapped in his death, unable to move on. Extra chapter, Fiona Hansen. My name is Fiona Hansen. I'm a psychotherapist. At the beginning of the year, I met a client, a polite and gentle lady from an affluent background. Although she didn't look well, she clearly wasn't in need of my services herself. As I suspected, she brought me to meet the real client. A 28-year-old woman. "This is my daughter-in-law. She and my son were in a car accident while on a road trip. My son died on the spot." The lady choked up for a moment. She was unconscious for 2 days, and when she woke up, her mental state became like this. I turned my head to look at the woman sitting on the sofa. She was beautiful, with a tall, slender figure and graceful posture. The lady said she used to be a dancer, and I smiled, saying I could tell. She sat quietly, fiddling with 2 intertwined bracelets on her wrist. Her name is Selena Crowley. You can call her Lena if you like. I nodded, trying to start a conversation with her. But she didn't speak, just turned her head to look at me. Her gaze unfocused, as if she were in a different world from us. She's always sleeping, awake for very little time during the day. The lady sighed, her eyes already rimmed with red. Please, help us. At first, I confidently took on this task. After a few days of interaction, I found that Selena was a very gentle person. Sometimes when I spoke, she would listen quietly. But just as I was preparing to advance the treatment, I ran into difficulties. Although Selena was indifferent and unconcerned about everything else, she reacted violently to anything related to Alvin Barton. For example, when I suggested changing the layout of her room, adding some bright colors. I also said we should try to reduce Alvin's presence as much as possible, even though he had passed away. Things like his belongings, we should minimize her contact with them. Otherwise, it's just repeated stimulation. Although Alvin's mother was grief-stricken, people always have to look forward. She did everything as instructed. However, Selena reacted very strongly to everything. She looked at me with fury, as if I were an enemy. She even spoke for the first time, saying I was a third party intruding into her world with Alvin. I was somewhat dumbfounded. I admit I might have been a bit hasty. So when my gaze fell on her wrist, she reacted even more strongly, clutching those 2 bracelets tightly, as if afraid I would take away the last thing Alvin left her. Alvin's mother wiped away tears beside us. For the first time, I felt at a loss. I had underestimated her feelings for Alvin. So a few days later, I chose another treatment method, hypnosis. I asked Alvin's mother about some details of their past and learned more about Selena's history. If it weren't for that car accident, our whole family should have been happily going to see the premiere of her new ballet. That day was also Alvin's birthday. He had it all planned out. We'd watch the performance together first, then he'd take us out to celebrate. He said he loved watching Lena dance most of all. Life is unpredictable. Perhaps only by facing the death of loved ones can the living find redemption. My treatment was just an insignificant guide. I wanted to give her some positive suggestions while her subconscious was relaxed. However, I miscalculated. My patient fell into a state of deep sleep, a state I could no longer control. But she didn't seem to be in distress. Well, let her sleep then, I thought. So I sat quietly beside her and waited all afternoon. During this time, I even considered giving up on this patient and refunding all the fees. Their love was too deep. How could I make someone who had lost their loved one bravely accept the truth? Perhaps only if the deceased himself stood in front of her and told her, "Wake up, accept reality, snap out of it." That might work. Absurd thoughts popped into my head, which I immediately suppressed. Because Selena in front of me slowly opened her eyes. The first words out of her mouth were, "I'm back." A world without Alvin Barton, but with her at 28, with the rest of her life ahead. Perhaps the meaning of the cycle is not to resurrect the dead, but to let the living find peace.